Today's story is based on the events surrounding the Pendle Witch trials. They are one of the most fascinating and darkest moments in British history. Back in 1612, a time when medical science barely existed and the only practitioners were mostly quacks. When anyone sick was often prescribed things that made them feel worse, the local wise women, or cunning people as they were often called upon to treat illnesses. These were normally women who lived on the fringes of society, often having knowledge of healing herbs and potions. But these women were sometimes viewed with suspicion, especially if they were poor, and married or perhaps a bit eccentric. They became scapegoats for everything bad that happened. They were blamed for everything from crop failures to the deaths of children. Sometimes the authorities actively persecuted these women, accusing them of consorting with the devil and using their powers for nefarious purposes. Other times, the accusations arose from the jealous gossip of envious neighbors. Now today's story is fictional, but it is based on some of the events that occurred during the Pendle Witch trials. These trials occurred over 2 periods in 1612 and 1616 in Pendle, Lancashire, England. In total, 12 people were accused of being witches. All were poor and all except one were female. Most of them were given unfair trials and some were tortured before being executed for a crime they didn't commit. One day, a mother named Agnes Miller was worried about her son Tom. He had contracted a high fever and no matter what she did, she couldn't get rid of it. She asked her friend, Eleanor, also known as Old Eleanor, to help her, not realizing that this would lead to her downfall. Old Eleanor was a cunning woman who made herbal remedies. She gave Agnes a bundle of herbs and told her to make a tea for Tom, and she claimed that it would reduce his fever. While the tea did seem to work, it soon wore off and Tom became even sicker. Agnes was desperate. She needed to do something to save her son. She went back to Old Eleanor and told her that the herbs hadn't worked. Eleanor told her to try one more remedy, saying that it was her last suggestion and that if it didn't work, then she couldn't help her. She gave Agnes another bundle of herbs and told her to grind them up and put them on a cloth, which she should then place on Tom's head. Agnes did this and watched anxiously as her son slept. She hoped that the remedy would work. In the morning, Agnes got up and found that Tom's fever had disappeared. He was sleeping peacefully and seemed much better. However, just hours later, Tom's fever returned with a vengeance. He started shaking and screaming, and it quickly became obvious that the child was dying. Agnes was devastated, but she believed that the herbs must have caused his illness to return. She knew that she needed to do something to help him, but what? Meanwhile, news of Tom's strange illness spread throughout the village of Market Weyton. Soon everyone was talking about it and blaming Old Eleanor for causing Tom's sickness. Things started to go from bad to worse. One day, a group of men came to arrest Old Eleanor for witchcraft. They accused her of cursing Tom and causing him to become ill. The timing was suspicious, and they believed that she was a witch. Now, despite her claims of innocence, Old Eleanor was taken away and locked up in a cell. But unfortunately, she wasn't there for long. Just a few days later, she was dragged before a court where she was forced to swim in a pond to prove her innocence. She didn't know how to swim, and as soon as she was released into the water, she began to panic and thrash around. The crowd gathered around the pond and watched intently as she struggled to stay afloat. Sadly, after a while, she began to sink, and although some people called out for her to be saved, no one dared to go in after her. And soon she was gone beneath the murky depths. But now with Eleanor out of the way, it was Agnes's turn to be accused. She heard the pounding of footsteps approaching her home and went to the door. She was shocked to see 4 men standing there. It was the parson, Edward Higgins, and 3 members of the parish constable, who told her that they wanted to speak to her about Tom's illness. She invited them in, and when she did, they immediately started searching the house. They tore through her meager belongings, looking for any sign of witchcraft. Eventually, they came across a piece of cloth that still smelled faintly of the herbs that Eleanor had given her. They brandished it like a weapon, and Agnes knew that she was trapped. The men confronted her with the cloth, and Agnes realized that she was in serious trouble. They accused her of being a witch and said that they were going to take her to court. Before she knew what was happening, she was bundled into a carriage and taken away. She was terrified, knowing that her life was about to change forever. At the trial, Agnes tried to defend herself, insisting that she had only used the herbs to try and cure her son. But no one believed her. The prosecution had already decided that she was guilty, and there was no way that she could convince them otherwise. To make matters worse, Higgins decided to use Tom's condition to strengthen his case. He claimed that Tom's illness was a clear sign that Agnes had made a pact with the devil. He said that only a witch could cause such a thing, and therefore Agnes must be one. He also pointed out that Agnes had been seen speaking to old Eleanor, who was known to be a witch. This was further proof, he said, that Agnes was guilty. In reality, Tom's illness was caused by a fever, something that even modern doctors struggle to diagnose and treat. But nobody listening wanted to hear that. Agnes was convicted of being a witch and sentenced to death. The crowd cheered, pleased with the verdict. On the day of her execution, Agnes was taken to the market square. A large crowd had gathered, and she could hear them jeering and shouting abuse. As she walked past them, she tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. Their words were like daggers, piercing her heart. When she finally reached the gallows, she was told to make a final speech. She denied being a witch, but no one listened. They just shouted louder, demanding that she confess to her crimes. Suddenly, Higgins stepped forward. He leaned down and whispered something into Agnes's ear. She gasped and turned to the crowd. She knew that she had to say something to save herself, so she confessed to everything. She admitted to being a witch and said that she had made a deal with the devil. She also confessed to killing her husband and turning him into a frog. She added that she had used her magic to make Eleanor look ugly so that no one would want to speak to her. Finally, she admitted to cursing Tom so that he would never be able to walk again. As she finished her confession, the crowd erupted. They shouted and cheered, and some even threw their hats into the air. Higgins beamed at them. He had just secured his reputation as a hero, a man who had saved his parish from a coven of witches. But none of them stopped to think that Agnes might have confessed to things that she didn't do. They were too busy celebrating their victory over the forces of darkness. When her confession was over, Agnes was led away to the gallows. She climbed the ladder and mounted the platform. The rope was placed around her neck and a hood was pulled over her head. Then everything went black. Later that day, Higgins addressed the crowd. He told them that Agnes's confession had proved that she was guilty and that he had saved them from evil. He urged them to be on the lookout for other witches and to report any suspicious activity to him immediately. The crowd listened intently, nodding their heads in agreement. They were eager to please Higgins and show their loyalty to him. But as the weeks passed, people began to notice that Tom was getting better. His fever was gone, and he was moving around freely once more. It was obvious that Agnes's confession had been a lie. She hadn't cursed him at all. In fact, her remedies had cured him. But by that time, it was too late. Agnes was dead and old Eleanor was rotting in her grave. The people of Market Wayington had been fooled, but they refused to admit it. They were too proud to admit that they had made a mistake. Agnes Miller shivered, clutching the coarse homespun cloth tied around her small son Tom. The wind howled through Market Wayton's narrow lanes, mimicking the restless torment in her gut. It was a chill that went beyond the October air, seeping deep into her bones and squeezing out hope like water from a sponge. The village square, usually a place of community and commerce, was a desolate stage for her mounting dread. Each house hunched like a conspirator, each shuttered window a staring eye. Agnes hurried on, seeking the sanctuary of Eleanor's cottage. With every step, the clamor of the village faded into an ominous hush. Relief washed over her as she saw Eleanor's modest cottage framed by a tangle of honeysuckle. The scent of sage and lavender drifting from the open door promised solace, or so Agnes hoped. Eleanor, a widow known for her healing herbs and quiet wisdom, was her last resort. "I am afraid," Agnes confided, pushing back a stray lock of hair. "My Tom, he is burning up with fever. The poultices I have tried have done little good. I must try something else." Eleanor's gaze, as clear and steady as a mountain stream, held Agnes's. "What troubles you most, dear Agnes?" "His fever, his delirium," Agnes whispered, fear thickening her voice. "The doctor was called, but he could offer nothing but prayers. And the babe, he calls out for me, yet shies away from my touch. My heart breaks at the sight." A shadow flickered across Eleanor's face. "You have sought the church. You have prayed. What else can be done?" "Sometimes, Agnes, the Lord's will must run its course." "But why him, Eleanor? What have we done to deserve this?" "Patience, Agnes. There are forces beyond our control." "It is true, but there may be others which we have overlooked." Eleanor spoke not only of remedies, but of understanding. She believed in the power of nature and the strength of women. Agnes clung to those words like a lifeline. Days turned into a blur of fevered nights and desperate care. Then, as suddenly as it started, Tom's fever broke. He slept deeply, then woke with a start, the fever dream etched on his flushed cheeks. Agnes cradled him close, tears of relief mingling with exhaustion. Her son was alive. The world, seen through a mother's lens, had tilted back on its axis. Her faith in God was shaken, but her bond with her son, forged in fire, was stronger than ever. Weeks later, however, trouble brewed in the seemingly tranquil village. Harvest was bountiful, yet gossip spread like a weed. Suspicions took root, nurtured by fear and ignorance. Crops failed, animals died, and misfortune hung heavy in the air. Accusations sharpened, seeking a culprit, a scapegoat. And Agnes Miller, with her solitary walks and herbs, became a convenient focus for simmering anxieties. One fateful evening, a group of men burst into Agnes's home, led by Parson Higgins, a man whose piety was as thick and cloying as the summer air. "Agnes, by order of the church, you are under arrest," he declared, his eyes gleaming with zealous certainty. "For what?" Agnes asked, her voice trembling, though she knew the answer. The men's faces, contorted with righteous anger, told her all she needed to know. "For the sickness of young Thomas Armitage. For the blight upon old man Fawcett's land. For the death of livestock and the pestilence that stalks our children. You are a witch, Agnes Miller, and the devil's work shall not stand." In the stifling silence that followed, Agnes's thoughts raced. The sickness, the blight, the deaths, all things beyond her control. Yet in a village gripped by fear, reason had no purchase. They had found a convenient target, and they were relentless. The following day, Agnes was led to the village center. A crowd had gathered, their faces grim, their eyes hard with accusation. She was a spectacle, a focal point for their collective terrors. "How do you plead, Agnes Miller?" boomed the magistrate, a stern figure cloaked in authority. "Not guilty," she whispered, the words swallowed by the crowd. Their murmurs rose like a storm cloud, drowning out her plea. The evidence against her was circumstantial, based on rumors, fears, and the testimonies of children too young to understand the gravity of their words. But in this atmosphere of terror, suspicion became fact and fear, the ultimate arbiter. With no witnesses to call, no defense to offer, Agnes's fate was sealed. The magistrate, bowing to the pressure of the crowd, made his decision. "By the power vested in me, I find you guilty of consorting with the devil. Your punishment shall be as ordained by the law. You shall be put to death by hanging." Despair settled over Agnes like a shroud. She walked among them, the bonds cutting into her wrists, her steps echoing in the oppressive silence. She was escorted to the edge of town, where the river ran sluggish and dark, its surface reflecting the leaden sky. This was no ordinary body of water. This was the crucible of accusations, the stage for judgments, the arena of fear. The river had been chosen for its unforgiving depth and its proximity to sin. The ceremony began with a disquieting ritual. Her hands were tied behind her back with a rough cord, leaving her arms aching and useless at her sides. She was stripped naked, save for a coarse linen cloth tied around her waist. And then, with a humiliating finality, she was stripped of that as well, baring her breasts and leaving her entirely at the mercy of the elements and the crowd's gaze. The air crackled with suppressed energy, each spectator holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. As Agnes stood at the brink, ready to meet her fate, her gaze swept across the faces of her accusers. She saw envy, malice, fear, and something darker, the lust for power, for control. In that moment, she understood that this was not just about her. It was about their need to dominate, to punish, to wield the power of life and death. The men stepped forward, each move laden with the weight of their malevolence. Her legs were tied together, a final act that left her helpless, at their mercy. Parson Higgins, his face twisted with pious zeal, approached first. He brandished the remains of her herbal sachet, the very thing that had been part of her desperate attempts to heal her son. "Look upon this, you people, the devil's own poison," he thundered. "Canst thou deny thy guilt, Agnes Miller?" His eyes gleamed with triumph. "No," she whispered, the word lost in the clamor. The rest of the men closed in, their voices rising in a menacing chorus. Witch! We know your ways. You have confessed." Their words, sharp as shards, pierced her soul. No confession had been wrung from her, but what difference did that make? Their minds were made up. She was shoved forward, stumbling toward the water's edge. The river's surface rippled, disturbed by both the wind and their presence. Agnes hesitated, her eyes searching for a way out, for a reprieve, for a miracle. But there was none. The river yawned before her, a dark abyss offering no comfort, no solace. Her accusers pushed her forward again, their faces pale in the dim light, their eyes gleaming with a dreadful excitement. Their intent was clear, their verdict final. Agnes braced herself for the inevitable. The priest stepped back, his eyes locked onto hers. "The Lord's judgment is swift. May God have mercy on your soul, Agnes Miller." Their voices echoed across the dark water. She floats, she floats. The devil takes her." Cheers erupted, harsh and triumphant, mocking her terror. The water, dark and unyielding, awaited its final offering. Agnes slid into the water, the cold enveloping her in an icy grip. Air rushed from her lungs in a gasp, her limbs flailing as she fought against the unseen forces trying to pull her under. She struggled to keep her head above the water, the current tugging at her, threatening to drag her deeper into its cold embrace. But she held on, her nails digging into the riverbed, her muscles screaming in protest. Her fingernails dug deep, not into flesh, but into cold stone. The damask was rough against her skin, the shape of it a dull ache beneath her palm. The room was dim, lit only by the pale sliver of sunlight forced between the two heavy drapes. Outside, the wind moaned, rattling the casement window. Inside, a tremor shook Agnes, less from the chill of the room than the gathering dread of her situation. It was a long way from the fields of heather and the banks of the river Ribble. A knock echoed in the vast chamber, demanding attention, commanding response. Agnes drew in a shuddering breath, willing her hands to stop shaking. A raspy voice cut through the silence. "Agnes Miller, daughter of Edmund and Alice, wife of Thomas, now deceased, and mother of Thomas, presently ailing, how dost thou plead to the charge?" At the far end of the room sat Justice Bradshaw, his face weathered, his gaze sharp, mirroring the glint of the morning sunlight on the steel clasp of his sword belt. His words hung in the air, weighty with implication. Guilty or not guilty? A decision not just for the moment, but for the rest of her life. In the shadowed corner of the room, Agnes whispered a prayer. Whatever she said now could cost her everything, years of happiness, her place in the community, her very life. "Not guilty, my lord," she replied, her voice barely audible. It was not a confession, nor was it acceptance. In the days following her arrest, much had transpired. First, the accusations, born out of fear, ignorance, and resentment. Then the examination by the parson, Reverend Edmund Custis, whose zealous piety knew no bounds. And finally, the swimming test, the culmination of centuries of superstition and unchecked fear. She had resisted, clinging to life and her sanity while the villagers watched, waited, and whispered. Now here she was in this unfamiliar room, facing a magistrate whose eyes spoke more of worldly dealings than divine inspiration, a room where the walls seemed to press in, where the silence screamed, and where fear was as tangible as the cold stone beneath her hand. Bradshaw leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Then we must see if the devil himself hath not already marked thee. The harsh words shattered the tense quiet. In that moment, Agnes understood. The swimming test was not a means to an end. It was the end itself. Justice Bradshaw wanted not proof of her innocence, but spectacle, condemnation, and public display. She was led back into the bright glare of day, the bailey and two other men flanking her. The market square was crowded, the chatter of townsfolk hushed to a murmur at their approach. Agnes walked slowly, her head bowed, her steps purposeful. As she reached the center of the square, a gasp rippled through the crowd. Before her lay a gaping hole, a makeshift dock laid across the surface of the river Ribble. Two sturdy men waited, gripping the ends of a thick rope, their faces grim, their eyes hard. She understood their purpose without needing words. They were to lead her to the river, tie her hands behind her back, and bind her feet together. Then they would lower her into the depths, releasing the rope only until she was fully submerged. If she floated, she was a witch. If she sank, she was innocent. Such was the logic of the swimming test, a brutal calculus of faith and fear. The river was cold, biting into her flesh with icy fingers, pulling at her strength, numbing her thoughts. She struggled against the rough twine, the coarse rope chafing, cutting into her wrists. The water closed over her head, stealing her breath, chilling her lungs. Terror, raw and primal, surged through her. Howling winds snatched at her, the rain-lashed clouds mirroring the turmoil within her. Yet somehow she held on, her nails digging into the riverbed, her muscles screaming in protest. The icy water surged around her, numbing her limbs and stealing the warmth from her chest. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale stabbing her lungs with cold fire. Above her, the faces of the villagers stared down, eyes wide, mouths moving in whispers she could not hear. She was alone, though surrounded by a sea of judgment. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear, sorrow, and desperate hope. She thought of Tom, curled in his small bed at home, fevered and weak. She remembered the herbs she had carefully prepared, the whispered prayers that had been her only shield against the sickness. And she remembered Eleanor, the widow of the woods, who had taught her which plants could soothe, which roots could heal. In the logic of the villagers, this knowledge, this lifeline, was now proof of her guilt. And then a strange calm descended. Perhaps it was the cold, perhaps the end, or perhaps it was simply the absence of fear. She was numb, both from the water and the realization that the outcome was beyond her control. As the minutes ticked by, the townspeople shifted restlessly, their voices rising and falling in anxious murmurs. Agnes ceased to be a person for them. She became a spectacle, a symbol of the fear that gripped their community. The river seemed to close in around her, a world of gray and cold, reflecting the sky above. She could feel the rope cutting into her wrists, binding her not just physically but symbolically to the judgment of her community. Every heartbeat pounded with the echo of centuries of fear, the fear that had shaped England since the first witch trials, that had been fanned by sermons, proclamations, and the writings of kings. King James I, whose demonology had been printed and circulated across the land, had made it clear witches existed, they consorted with the devil, and they must be punished. In this small pond at the edge of Market Wayington, centuries of law, superstition, and authority converged upon Agnes Miller. She tried to push against the cold, to twist, to sink anything to escape the weight of accusation pressing down like the very water around her. But it was impossible. The rope kept her tethered, the bindings preventing resistance. She could only float, and in floating, she was condemned. The faint shuffling of the crowd, The wind rustling reeds lapped against the shore. Sounds grew muted, distant. All she could see was the endless expanse of gray sky and water. The village, the accusations, the trial, all receded into the background noise of a nightmare. She was suspended in the cold, waiting for the final blow. But it never came. After an eternity that was surely minutes, she felt a change. The rope tightened, urging her under. She struggled, gasping for breath, her limbs flailing. She understood then she was not drowning, she was being pulled down. With a surge of adrenaline, she kicked, her feet finding purchase on the riverbed. She was sinking, not dying. She tried to call out, but only a strangled cry escaped her lips. She was pulled further, the water closing over her head, silencing her scream. She thrashed, clawing at unseen support, desperate to reach solid ground. But the riverbed was a confusing maze of weeds and silt. She was trapped in a suffocating underwater grave. Then abruptly, the struggle was over. The pressure of water eased, replaced by the chilling caress of air on her skin. She opened her eyes to a world turned upside down. The sky was a dizzying swirl of color. The trees swayed in a hypnotic dance, the wind singing a haunting tune. The familiar world was distorted, dreamlike. She could feel the strength draining from her, her limbs growing heavy, her vision blurring. The whispers of the crowd, the rush of the river, the cries of the birds, all faded into a distant hum. Consciousness ebbed away, taking with it the fear, the accusations, and the icy grip of the river. When Agnes regained consciousness, she found herself lying on a pile of straw in a dimly lit room. The scent of hay and manure filled her nostrils. She tried to sit up, but a searing pain in her wrist forced her back down. She looked down to see the rope bindings still secured tightly around her. The door creaked open and a face peered in. It was the parson, Reverend Edmund Custis. His eyes gleamed with triumph. "So the good Lord hath delivered his verdict," he said, his voice ringing with self-righteousness. "Dost thou feel the power of the Almighty now, Agnes?" He stepped closer, his face twisted with malice. "Yield not, foolish woman. Resist not thy fate, for thou art a child of the devil." The accusation hung in the air between them, a tangible thing. Agnes felt a surge of anger mixed with exhaustion. She did not have the strength to argue, to deny. She was simply too tired. Later, when she was brought before the magistrate again, his face grave and unforgiving, she heard the words that sealed her fate. "By the laws of God, Queen and country, ye are found guilty of the crime of witchcraft. I hereby sentence you to death by burning at the stake. The flames will claim your body, but your story will haunt history, and if you crave more dark tales from the past, hit subscribe button and the notification bell for more.